Well, I am so glad to see everyone here today, and it is great to be back up here. I've never had 3 Sundays off in a row ever, and so this was a new experience for me, and it was a new experience for Dad here to be here 3 Sundays in a row, but we were grateful for it. Now, to be fair, 2 of them were planned, but I just didn't get to actually be here in person for that second one, and of course not the third one. So glad to be back with you. And so this is kind of like the message that was prepared was kind of for New Year's. It was kind of for the new season as we got things kicked off. So we're delayed a couple weeks on that, but I don't think that's anything new since 2020. Everything seems to be delayed just a little bit. And so as I get ready for this new year, as we get ready to look where we go as a church, as we kind of set direction, as we set vision, there's a couple of words that I've been wrestling through that I think are important words for us to consider today. Let me give you the definition of the first word. The act or quality of withstanding hardship or stress. The act or quality of withstanding hardship or stress. So you're probably thinking, what word would that be? And you probably come up with a couple in your head, but the word we're looking at there is endurance. Endurance is the act or quality of being able to withstand hardship and stress. Now there's a second definition I want to give you for another word. To remain constant to a purpose or task in the face of obstacles. To not abandon what is undertaken. To remain constant to a purpose or task in the face of obstacles. To not abandon what is undertaken. Now that's similar to endurance, but it's a little bit different, and that is the word perseverance. So we have the word endurance and we have the word perseverance. And what I've discovered is you need both of these in life. It's not enough to have endurance and it's not enough to have perseverance. You need both because they both perform a slightly different function. For example, I would say that endurance refers to the power, the ability to withstand hardship, stress, or difficulty. But it doesn't answer the why. Perseverance is the why. The focus, what allows you to push through that difficulty. Anybody can say, I want to withstand this, but you need to have a why, because life will beat you up. Life will chew you up and spit you out and make it so difficult for you, you want to quit. Why will you not quit? What will be your focus, your goal, your motivation to keep pushing forward when life is challenged? That's what perseverance will do for you. But perseverance is not the ability. Endurance is the ability. You need both in life. And what I've often found is in churches often get sideways in this particular area. And I'm not referring to Crestwood Christian Church. I'm just saying churches, generically speaking. Churches tend to get sideways with this when their focus is wrong. They have endurance. They don't close their doors. They keep pushing forward. They keep having worship every week. But their why is what is wrong, and that's why they are declining and ultimately closing. What's that look like? Well, Ben Merrill told a great story when I was in Bible college. I took one of his classes called Current Issues in Ministries. He and Dr. Veach shared that class together with us, and he told a story about how a church in Illinois called him in so that he could give them advice on how to move forward as a church, which is great. Ben Merrill was a great grower of churches. God used him in some crazy ways. He went to Harvester Christian Church when it was a church of less than 200 and struggling. He was 65 years old. The average age of his church was 29 years old. And God took it, and over the course of about a 20-year ministry, it went from a little less than 200 to a little over 3,000. And since that point, I believe it's doubled and has 3 separate sites that meet every Sunday. God did some pretty amazing things. So if you wanted some direction and guidance, Ben Merrill's a great resource. And he's still out there working in the churches at 95 years old right now. So he got called into a church in Illinois, and they wanted his advice. And he walked in, and in the middle of their stage, they had a wooden pulpit. Very normal, nothing wrong with that. That's completely fine. But on the pulpit, they had carved, ingrained in the pulpit was the order of service. And Ben Merrill said right there, it's over. You have worshiped the order of service. You have decided this order of service is so perfect, it never needs to change. And so what happens is often churches will worship the things that are supposed to worship God. They worship the order of service. They worship the activities of the church more than who those things are supposed to point to. Again, I'm speaking about churches generically, not calling us out for anything in particular, not calling out any other church for anything specific. Just saying this is what can often happen if we're not careful. Our perseverance, our focus, our task is off course, even though our endurance, our ability to withstand, might be good. And this is when churches run into serious problems. So maybe you're asking the question, okay, Mark, and that's fair, but what is the focus of the church? What should the perseverance of the church be? Well, I think Jesus makes it exceptionally clear in Matthew chapter 28. He is, at this point, he's died, he's risen from the dead, and he's giving final instructions to the disciples who are getting ready to establish the church. And what does he say? He gives that section called the Great Commission. Now, I'm not going to quote it for you just yet, but you're probably familiar with the Great Commission. You're like, oh, I know that term, I know that passage. But here's the problem. If I had to guess, if we handed out a sheet of paper to all Christians in all churches across the country today and asked them, write down what the Great Commission says, I think the grade would be beyond failing. If I had to guess, and this is a complete guess, probably less than 10% of all Christians gathered in churches today could quote for you the Great Commission accurately. Now, maybe 25% could come up with part of it. But I think those who actually know the content and context of it would be hard to find. And that's not a judgment against Christians today. If anything, maybe it's a judgment against the preachers for not putting out there what the purpose, the focus, the goal of the church was always meant to be. Jesus said it best, that we are to go into all the world, preaching the good news, baptizing in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching people to obey all the things that Jesus has commanded, and surely he's with us always to the very end of the age. That's the Great Commission of the church. That's the focus and the task. Everything we do as a church should be centered around that premise. But so often, that's not the goal of the church. Oh, it's an aspect of the church, but it's not the foundation of the church. So often the goal of the church is, what can the church do for me? We all tend to be selfish in that way. I mean, humans by our very nature can be very selfish. And so in the church, we often say, what does the church do for me? Do I like their program? Do I like their music? Do I like what they offer? Is this good for me? And so often we forget that we are supposed to invest back in the church and the mission of the church to help and reach others. That we are to be sacrificial of ourselves to benefit the kingdom work that goes on in our local church. The church is so off target today because we have missed the Great Commission. We have the wrong perseverance, the wrong focus. But when we get our focus right, when we get excited for the mission of the church, it's contagious, and we want to talk to others about it. Now, a couple weeks ago, I talked to you, I guess a few weeks ago now, I talked to you about Milo and his addiction to fishing. And we went through all the different things that we've done since he got hooked on fishing, that was an accident, back in June, and or May, whatever it was. And so, anyway, he completely obsessed, going to be 8 years old next month. Just everything in his life centers around fishing. So an interesting thing happened this past week. He ordered a new reel through Amazon because he had saved up his money from Christmas. He wanted a bait caster, so whatever. So he gets his reel in. And so he gets on a video phone call with his cousin, Elena. Elena's a couple years older than him, my brother's daughter. And he calls her because they play games online all the time, Roblox, Minecraft, things like that. And so he gets on the phone with Elena. He says, Elena, is your dad home? And, well, yeah, he's in the living room. Can I talk to him? And for the next 30 minutes, Milo called Elena, acting like he wanted to talk to her, but in fact wanted to talk to her dad. And so all of a sudden I'm like, I hear my brother's voice. I mean, I know I'm going crazy at times, but I know I hear his voice. And so I go down there, and they're on the iPad. Milo's showing the reel, and he's talking all this fishing stuff going on and on. I'm like, Milo. I'm like, hi, Andy. Milo, how did you get his number? Oh, I called Elena. So Elena was expecting to play games with you. Yeah. So why are you talking to Andy about fishing? I'm like, that's great, that's fine, but finally you need to not to be so deceiving. You need to play with Elena. And so, but that's just the way Milo works. Anytime he has the opportunity to talk about fishing, anytime he has the opportunity to make that his focus, he does it. And he's excited for it, and it is a little bit contagious. I mean, I have to admit, since he's been into it, I've been a lot more into fishing and thinking about it and planning some things, and it's kind of reinvigorated that love for me. But that's what happens when you get excited about something. It becomes contagious. And I just wonder, as Christians, and there's no judgment, it's just a question I need to ask you. When was the last time you had an excited conversation about the Great Commission? When was the last time you had this invigorating conversation that was all about how do we reach a lost world for Jesus? Instead of, how can we not step on so many toes? How can we be nice? How can we, make things comfortable? When was the last time you had a really great conversation that you left and said, man, someone's life is going to be changed as a result of this? Now, it's embarrassing for me to think, wow, I can't remember the last time I had such a moving, impactful conversation. But when you have a passion for something, you want to share it. You want to tell others about it, even if they don't participate. We need to get serious about the mission of the church. And if we spend more time talking about the mission of the church and how it makes a positive difference in the lives of others, then the churches will begin to fill up again. The churches will begin to be impactful in their communities again. The churches will be relevant again. But as it stands right now, so many are irrelevant. And that's because most of our conversations have nothing to do with doctrine. They have nothing to do with the holiness of God. They have nothing to do with things that are eternal. Jesus talked about that in the Sermon on the Mount. He said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So we're to seek first the things of God, the kingdom of God, which is where moth and rust do not destroy, and the thieves do not break in and steal. But so often we focus on things that are temporary, things that will eventually go away. As a church, we need to develop serious endurance and perseverance. I, in fact, created a word to describe it for you. Spell check does not like it. You will not find it in a dictionary, but it is the word Enduraverance. That is going to be the word for the year. Enduraverance. We need endurance and we need perseverance. We need to have the ability to withstand hardship, and we need to have the right focus and task in order to get it done. And so that is the goal for the year, is to have Enduraverance personally and corporately as a church. The question is, how do you develop it? How do you develop Enduraverance? Well, it goes back to a personal example for you. This goes back about 13 years. I've been here 13 and a half years, and Coach Nelson and I have developed an awesome friendship during that time, and he was the first person who pointed out to me that maybe I had put on a little too much weight. That's the politically correct way of saying it. And I said, oh, okay. And actually, he was 100% right. And he said, so why don't you do something about that? And it turns out that he believes runners are the best athletes. Is that still true, Coach? I said, oh yeah, okay. So I said, all right, I'll start running. And of course, that was miserable because I couldn't run from here to the end of the sanctuary without huffing and puffing. But I'm like, all right, I can do this. And I signed up, did my first 5K race. It was great. Had a good time. Then my friend and I, we found this thing called a mud run, where you run a 5K, but there's mud pits you run through. But, oh, that sounds fun. Let's do that. So we did it. And before long, my sister starts running. And then we found this thing called the Spelunking Challenge down in Crystal City. You remember that one? It's in the Crystal City sand mines down there. You had to run with a headlamp on because it's pitch black on the inside. And so you run through the sand mines and everything. And that was pretty cool. Then I found this thing called Tough Mudder. Half marathon, 13.1 miles, 25 obstacles. Some of them you have to have a partner to complete because they're too big, too difficult to do on your own. And so I had a group of 4 of us. We went and did that. It took us about 5 hours to complete the race. There was some line weights, of course, for some of the obstacles, but it was a really long, difficult race. But then I found a series called the Spartan Series. That's where my heart is right now for racing. It's an obstacle course series for individuals. And I've done the 5K, I've done the 8-mile race. But in this race, every time you fail an obstacle, you have to do 30 burpees as a penalty. And I was going to demonstrate that, but I don't want to untuck my microphone because it'll pull out of my pocket and make it, Zach, nah, you just stay, you're fine. So, but burpees, it's a tough workout. So what I had to do when I was running a 5K, or when I ended up running a couple of half marathons, or when I did the obstacle course training, is I had to adjust my training methods. For example, when I ran the half marathon, I had a training schedule from Hal Higdon, and I followed it, mostly. And so when he said, you need to run 5 miles today, I ran 5 miles. When he said, take a day off, I took a day off. When he said, run 10 miles, I ran 10 miles. I did whatever the schedule said to do. But when I trained for the Spartan Race series, it wasn't enough to run 13 miles. I had to add in burpees and certain exercises that I knew I was going to be doing during the race. And so I would run for a mile, and I'd drop and I'd do 30 burpees. And then I'd get up and I'd start running again. People look at you pretty funny, by the way, when you're running down the road and you drop and do burpees on the sidewalk. But you do it. And so I kept adjusting my training, but the task always remained the same. The focus was always the same. Finish the race. That was always the goal. That never changed. But how I prepared to finish the race changed. And that's what it should be like in the church. The task should have always been the same. Go into all the world and share the good news. How we do that changes. As society changes, as people communicate differently, we have to learn to communicate differently. We have to learn to adapt our styles and our methods to better reach a lost world. But it's always for the same goal, the same task, that some people might accept Jesus as their Savior. Now, I'd love to tell you, well, here's the simple answer. Here's what we have to do. We're working on that. We don't exactly know what that looks like yet, but I know it has to be done. I know it's the steps that need to be taken. As a church, we need Enduraverance. Of course, you're asking, how is that actually done? How do we develop Enduraverance? Well, I'm mindful of Hebrews chapters 11 and 12. Chapter 11 is, I'll overview it for you. It's what we call God's Hall of Faith, or Hall of Fame, however you want to look at it. And the author of Hebrews goes through this whole list of people who faithfully follow God, going back to Abel and all the way through Jacob and Joseph and Daniel and David, all kinds. A list, Rahab, just this great list of people and their wonderful accomplishments. It was great. All their accomplishments by faith in God that they accomplished. But then in verse 32, it takes this change of tone. It says that there were some who conquered kingdoms because of their faith. They administered justice for their faith. The widows received back their dead. Wow, this is pretty amazing. Following God has some awesome perks attached to it. But then the tone transitions again. It says others were destitute. They went around and hid in holes in the ground. They were stoned, and some were sawed into. The world was not worthy of them. Following God with great faith sometimes led to the conquering of kingdoms, and at other times it led to their death. That's amazing. I mean, that's just something that I can't fathom, that following God can have such great extremes attached to it. But notice, whether they conquered kingdoms or were sawed into, there was one goal: bring glory and honor to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And that's what it has to be for us as well. If we're going to have Enduraverance, then we need to bring glory and honor to the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, whether that makes us the most popular or the most hated people in the world today. This is not a popularity contest with the world. It's about doing what honors Him and Him alone. Hebrews chapter 11, picking it up in verse 39. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. How do we develop Enduraverance as a church? 3 very simple things I want to tell you today. Number 1 is this: remember, God has something better in store. God has something better in store. Again, that's what we just read at the end of Hebrews 11. All these people were committed for their faith, but they hadn't yet received what God had promised. They didn't know what the kingdom of God looked like. They didn't understand the church. They didn't know what the Messiah would be, or that He would give His life in a sacrificial way. They didn't get that. But they lived a life of faith, trusting God would see it safely through. And for us, ultimately, we don't get to experience what God has in store until we leave this life, or He returns to take us with Him, whichever should happen first. God has something better in store. So much of our life is spent on what is temporary. So much in our life is spent on things that do not last. And it's okay to have a nicer car, a nicer house, a nice retirement, whatever. That's fine. Those aren't bad things. But when that becomes the focus of our life, when that becomes what is primary and the things that are eternal become secondary, that's when we lose enduraverance. That's when we lose the ability to be focused on what God truly wants us to see and be about. So we need to be very careful about that. There's a principle I read in a book a few years ago that was called the Bob Barker Principle of Life. We'll call it the Price is Right Principle of Life, as it's Drew Carey now hosting the show. But what it was about was, the show is based on, there's different products, and you bid on the product. And if you're under, you have a chance to get it. But anytime you overbid on something, even by $1, you lose everything. You lose everything by overvaluing something. And if we're not careful, if we overvalue the things that are temporary and undervalue the things that are eternal, maybe we're at risk of losing everything too. We're at risk of losing what truly matters in life. So let's get our focus right. Let's get our perseverance figured out. Let's have the right task in front of us. And one of the ways to do that is to remember God has something so much better than the things that are temporary in this world. Secondly, remember we are not alone. We are not alone. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1. Therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. That's amazing. He goes through all these people of faith in history, and now they are witnesses to us who are living today. Your grandparents, your parents, a sibling, maybe a child, whoever is out there that is no longer in this world, they are your witness today, encouraging you, pushing you to get across that finish line. Sometimes you get to hear it when they're with you. Sometimes it's after they've passed on, but you got to remember there are people rooting for you. There are witnesses that are pushing you to keep your enduraverance right. There's been a couple of examples of that in my life. My race history, one of the ways that happened was when Beth and I ran our first half marathon. I would say we both slightly undertrained for it. We did a lot of training, but never having run one before, I think we both wanted to improve after it was over. But it was a terrible race too. It was in the wind, both ways. I don't know how that happened. Wind in your face, both ways. It was 2 laps, 2 giant laps through Litchfield, Illinois, which is a miserable way to do a race, by the way. Next time, no way. Anyway, so you did 2 big laps. So Mom and Dad and Bellamy and Sailor and Missy, they kind of parked themselves about 3 miles into the race. So we go running by, and there they are, hey, and that's how it was the first 3 miles. And then all the way back, it's been 6 miles, and still doing good, hey. The next one, it was 9 miles, it's, hey, Beth and I ended up running the last several miles together, and we were coming up on Mom and Dad, and we got past them, and then they all got in the car and drove to the finish line, and I said, they're not watching, I want to walk now. And Beth said, I agree. So we walked, and when we got to the part where they were going to see us again, we decided it's time to run again, and so we ran again. And but we knew they were witnesses to us, and we wanted to finish strong because we knew that they were observing us. And so often in life, we just want to coast. We just want to get by and say, that's good enough. I'm so glad Jesus didn't say that's good enough. He gave everything for us. And so because of that, we need to run with enduraverance. There are men and women of faith who gave everything in their life to follow him and honor him. And they are witnesses encouraging us to cross the finish line today. Let us be faithful as they've been faithful. One other example, and I want to touch on what Dad talked about here recently with you, John and Charlotte Titsworth, that wonderful couple from the church back home. They were about the age of my grandparents. And they were great encouragers, and they did a lot to sow seeds in kingdom work that was going on. And one of the people they sowed seeds in was me. They put down a significant portion of money towards my first semester at St. Louis Christian College. And Dad told a little bit of the story, but there's actually just a little bit more to it. So about the time I was getting ready to enroll in college and to pursue ministry, there was some issue at the church that took place with some kind of vote. And I was pretty upset with how things had turned out. And so I went to Dad afterwards, and I said, Dad, I don't think I want to devote my life to a ministry when something as simple as silly as a church vote that goes awry just messes everything up. I said, this does not sound fun to me. This sounds like misery. I have no interest in doing that. And Dad just said, I understand. He said, so what are you going to do? I said, well, I still want to help people. I still want to share the good news. I said, I think I'll do it as a counselor. I'll do it one-on-one with people. I'll help them get through their problems, but I just can't. I can't do church life. That's not for me. And Dad said, I understand. It's no problem. He goes, but you need to know something. John and Charlotte have put money on your education at the college. I don't know how much it is. It could be $100, it could be $500, it could be $1,000. I don't know. It's just some amount of money, and you need to know that they've done that for you. I said, oh. I said, well, what do you think I should do? Dad's like, well, if you're going to be a counselor, it's still good to have a biblical-based education. Maybe you could start your first year at SLCC, get a nice foundation for your faith, and then, transfer into whatever you need to do for your counseling degree. And I thought, well, that seems very reasonable. I can do that. Well, I hadn't been at the college a couple of weeks before I realized I was called to preach. And I did that ever since. Starting the first semester, end of the first semester of my freshman year, I preached in a small country church for 4.5 years until I graduated and came here. And so I completely understood that was my calling. But I may not have done that. I may have done something completely different had they not been witnesses to me, had they not invested in me. It's not enough to remember that we have witnesses and we're not alone. We need to be a witness to somebody else. We need to be that person who's encouraging someone else to come along, to step up, and to make a kingdom difference. I most likely would not be standing here today had it not been for John and Charlotte. I don't know who it is for you, the reason that you're sitting here today, or that you have the connections or opportunities that have come your way. But we all have witnesses in our life. Let's remember them and be motivated by them, and also be the witness for somebody else. Last thing, focus on Jesus. We need to remember to be focused on Jesus. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. When you're going to run with Enduraverance, you will grow weary. You will be tired. You will want to quit. But when we focus on Jesus, it says we will overcome the weariness and we will not lose heart. You only do that by focusing your eyes completely and totally on him. So my question to you today is, are you focused on Jesus? Are your eyes focused on Jesus? Not glancing his way once in a while. Yep, he's still there. Are you actually focused on him? The problem with so many churches today is they're focused on, how do I make people feel better? They're so busy on, how can we have something fun to do? How can we make everybody happy? Well, when you focus on Jesus, those are sometimes the byproduct. But he's got to be the focus. We have to completely look to him. One of my favorite stories in history goes back to John Wesley. I believe he's from the 1700s. And his brother Charles Wesley was a famous hymn writer, and many of the hymns that were written that you've sung through your childhood and even here at times, they are found in the hymn books. I think he wrote some 10,000 hymns, so just a prolific hymn writer. Anyway, John Wesley was considered one of the greatest preachers of all time through the Reformation era. And one of the things that he was interviewed once and was asked, because people always came to hear him preach, he was asked, what's your secret? Why do so many people show up to hear you preach? And John Wesley said, well, I get alone with God in prayer, and he sets me on fire, and then people come out to watch me burn. And I love that analogy that he uses, that when he gets alone with God, God sets him on fire. And then people see his passion for the Word of God, and they want to show up to see what it's all about. Notice it doesn't mean they all convert. It doesn't mean they all become followers of Jesus, but they're impressed. They say, wow, there's something special about this guy. He's really serious about his relationship with God. Anytime that you've met somebody who's been truly focused on Jesus, that honoring him has been their first priority, you always come away saying, wow, I'm impressed. And that impression can often lead to change in your own life. It is so important that we get focused on Jesus so that others can see us burn with a passion for him. And it's going to make all the difference in the kingdom work that goes on all around you. So as the worship team joins me back on stage, where's your focus today? Have you been running with Enduraverance? Do you have the endurance, the ability? Do you have the perseverance, the focus? If not, let's start getting back on track right now. It's not going to be figured out overnight. It's not going to be figured out in a matter of weeks or even months. But through a life that is continually focused on Jesus, eventually we'll get exactly where He wants us to be. It's tough to run with Enduraverance, but I tell you what, out of all the races I've run, the one thing is consistent. Crossing that finish line is awesome. And only Jesus makes it possible for us to cross the finish line of this life and join Him in eternity. Let's be focused on Him. Let's choose to honor Him. And this morning, if you have a decision to make, if you need to put Jesus first and foremost in your life, meet me down front as we stand and as we sing.